You're in the hands of an adolescent.
It's mystery. I don't like mysteries. Your bellyache. I got a duty right now.
Aye, sir.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the Warp Core Podcast. I am Ursa Master. With me, as always, is Lord Uther Pendragon, and today joining us, the notorious and highly underrated Ford Fairlane. Welcome everyone back to the show. Well, we've arrived. We've boldly went through quite possibly the finest Star Trek release of all time, and we will definitely talk about how we feel about it as a whole today. But we will focus very specifically on Episode 10, the series finale of Star Trek Picard. And I think this might have been the most talked about television, even more so than The Mandalorian, that I've encountered in a long time. Like, there were people I didn't even know who were Star Trek fans on my social media talking about how they were anticipating the end of Picard. We've talked about it before. Streaming is in sort of a golden era. You could liken it perhaps to the 70s in television with some of the strong sequel series we have going now, or prequel series or spin-off series, and really just some of the absolute classic television we're seeing. So, for a little background on today's episode and some of the accompanying features of a series finale of this magnitude, we're going to turn it over to the good Ford Fairlane, who's going to walk us through some interesting tidbits he's found out.
Thank you, Ursa Master. Thank you, Lord Uther, and thanks to you at home. Yes, tonight it is The Last Generation, written and directed by Season 3 showrunner Terry Matalas. So he deserves all the praise, or depending on how you're feeling, all the blame. But one way or the other, it was his singular vision. And he had a fairly grand vision, talking in terms of like Avengers Endgame style, bring it all to the forefront. And I think he squeezed every last budgetary penny that he could into this finale. It's almost, you can't even tell it was made for TV, and you think back to the limited production value that they were able to offer in 1987 when Star Trek The Next Generation launched, and you see the difference. This was cinema quality and so forth. And even saying that, even with the massive investment that Paramount puts into the Star Trek franchise, and this show in particular, and this episode in particular, there were still budget battles and things that they just, quite frankly, couldn't get in front of the camera because of the penny pinchers at Paramount. Sorry, Paramount. But in interviews conducted this week with Matalas, he revealed that there was going to be a whole host of other faces we might have seen. Harry Kim from Star Trek Voyager was going to make an appearance. We were going to discover that Ro Laren had actually survived her sacrifice earlier this season, and so she was supposed to make a comeback. Admiral Janeway was ticketed to appear at one point. They were even going to bring back Soji from Season 1 and briefly Season 2 of Picard to have a moment with Data. But all of these, unfortunately, were fell by the wayside. To illustrate just the time constraints and pressures and budgets and such, that a show like this, I mean, again, we imagine that they would just, whip out the checkbook and write the figures. Shooting on the bridge of the Enterprise D, which was a huge moment at the end of our last episode and figured, factored primarily into this one. They only had 2 days, 2 shooting days of this television schedule to get the crew onto this. They were still gluing the carpet down when it was time to start shooting it. And Matalas on online interviews talks about feeling that pressure of trying to, rush to meet the schedule and do everything that was required of the shoot, and yet still capture the emotion, which he had to rely almost solely on the actors themselves rather than anything that was scripted or what have you, and just had to pray that once it was all put together in the assembly and post-production that they got it. And he said to his immense relief and the fact that this talented cast was so comfortable working together that, that shorthand paid off handsomely. But it makes you scratch your head a little just to think that even with something of this magnitude and all of the time and investment that they put in it, that they would still be nagging, like, hey, you gotta, you only get 2 days in here. They didn't get much time to really enjoy it. Patrick Stewart is quoted in an online interview this week saying that it probably means more to the fans to see us there. He said, honestly, we've been on that set for, 30 years, give or take, where all the various incarnations and so forth. He's like, to us, it's just furniture. He said, but to the fans, obviously, it casts a spell. And he's right, because from the opening tease throughout the episode, just seeing the crew in their stations, each of them contributing to this last stand valiant effort against the Borg cube and the Borg queen. Again, this is what we paid for. This is what we've been dreaming of. We were denied this kind of emotional narrative closure 21 years ago with Nemesis. And, arguably, which we'll get to later in the cast, the last shot, the final shot of how were they going to send the next-gen crew off, if you will, much like we talked about Star Trek VI and the signatures and et cetera, et cetera. It was the most appropriate callback, echo, reenactment, or however you want to label it, to, again, one of the all-time great send-offs of television. All good things in 1994. That truly, just taken on its own, forgetting that there would later be features and streaming shows and all that, if that is where the crew of the Enterprise D had left their mark and finished the story, it was a terrifically satisfying way to sort of, beam out of that crew. But that was all the behind-the-scenes stuff. What did we get on camera? Well, my goodness, we got Chekhov's son, Anton Chekhov, not Pavel, yet played by Pavel, Star Trek alum Walter Koenig, doing a voiceover, and this episode will continue a theme of echoes from Star Trek IV: The Voyage Home. In this case, a broadcast to all Starfleet vessels: stay away from Earth. We're under attack, and we're probably not going to make it. And in fact, some of the dialogue sounds directly cribbed from Voyage Home, while the crew looks on anxiously, bringing them to the moons, the rings of Jupiter, where we get our Titanic showdown at last with the Borg Queen. As far as actual plot elements in this episode, it's lightly plotted. That is to say, most of it is just frenetic forward action and resolution. We've gone past the point of new character developments and things of that nature. I think the single biggest thing I wanted to sort of start with is this idea of Picard's arc. And if you go all the way back to June 18th, 1990, which is when the Best of Both Worlds Part 1 aired for the first time in syndicated television, and we were introduced to Locutus of Borg, and Riker said to Worf, Mr. Worf, fire. Again, a cliffhanger for the ages. This final episode of Picard, it goes all the way back to that moment, 30 plus years ago. And we see that the Borg is the family that he rejected in lieu of the Starfleet family that he embraced, in lieu of the family that he didn't even know he had when he and Beverly were laying pipe, in the words of Ursa Master, and created Jack Crusher. So family permeates the whole arc of this show of Picard, seasons 1, 2, and 3, but particularly here in 3. And to see him squaring off with the Borg Queen, who feels like a scorned mom. You turned your back on us, Locutus. Look at what we have here. We have a son. We have you. We have me. So I wanted to kind of probe into that a little bit, because that completely gives a new life to everything we know about Picard from that moment forward till now. Now that we've seen the finish line, where it all ends up, and how we feel about his arc as a character, and the choices that he eventually ends up making in this episode, the very existential choices in terms of choosing family, because he makes it a really big choice in here. It turns out all the well for Star Trek fans, but had it gone another direction, I think I might have been just as emotionally satisfied with that resolution. So I'll throw it to whichever one of you two can speak to Picard's arc and what you thought it all meant.
Well, normally I take center stage now, so I'll do so again. It's tough, right? Because there's a feeling of finality to all of this for this TNG crew that we know and love. Even though, as Jonathan Frakes so boldly predicted ahead of this season, that nobody dies, and thank goodness for that, because this is way better. Although they come very close, which is classic for the TNG crew. Which holds true to the fans, holds true to, I think, the story. But I go back to, this is some of the finest writing I think Star Trek has ever had. And I say that for a couple of reasons. I think Terry Matalas has a very high level of respect for canon, and a high level of respect for how to take what could be a fangirl service, fanboy service, nostalgia trip, and transforms it into something new, something better, but holds a very high esteem and high regard for all that came before. And we get a completion of a character here that does actually still leave the door open for Picard to have influence and interaction in future series, but also gives Picard a succinct, clear character development. I think you could argue that through Nemesis, Jean-Luc Picard really is kind of a static character. He ends Nemesis only slightly more emotional than he started the series. He really hasn't dealt with a lot of the personal strife they flirted with in the films. Losing his nephew and his brother, those heavy moments where the lights just kept dimming and dimming and dimming, to this episode where the lights barely are even on in this Borg cube. And I don't know if y'all noticed, but it gets a lot brighter after, during the denouement. So it's like, wow, the lights literally came back on, which it tickled me pink the second time I watched it through today. And this is the first episode of the entire series that I watched twice in the same day. But it really felt like they did justice to a character. I think with a lot of these sort of revivals or spin-offs that try to entreat prior characters with new stories, or some sort of a conclusion to their story, you don't quite get what you want. It leaves you with like, yeah, it's over, but now it's like, was it really the payoff I wanted all these years later? Look at movies like Zoolander 2, which was way past when it should have been made. And I know this is an odd comparison, but I always kind of wondered, what was the conclusion for Derek Zoolander? Was he going to have children? And what was that going to look like? Because he's got an IQ of like 40. And then what they did was just utterly disappointing, although Will Ferrell made that movie watchable. But this is not like that at all. They actually took not just Easter eggs. Like, this is like all of the Easter Sundays we've ever had in these past 35 years combined. They dug really deep to capture every nuance, and they somehow wormed it in while incorporating seasons 1 and 2, which were seemingly unrelated to this season, which I think is a tremendous, again, testament to the craft behind this season. specifically in the writers' room, but the whole series, cast, crew, probably down to the grips. I mean, just the way they made this happen, not just for Picard, but for every character, it felt very complete in the best sense of that term. I felt everybody got an ending, in a sense, to their character from the original series run that gave them all fruition of some kind, where they could legitimately walk away from these characters as is, with no other cameos, no other movies, no other appearances or whatever, and I'm wholly satisfied with what I've seen. And there's a few reasons for that, and we'll get into that a little later. But Picard, I think, with Nemesis, and even with seasons 1 and 2, because we've talked about would this be enough, knowing what we know now from this season, I mean, clearly it would not have, we would have been left with too many open questions. And I think Metalis did a really nice job. Again, there's going to be a couple of bombshells we talk about later, but did a really nice job putting a lovely, lovely bow, and not just leaving doors open, but like kicking some doors open that needed to be kicked open. And I'll turn it over to Lord Uther because I know he wants to talk. I know he wants to say something. He's thinking it. I can see it playing out on his face. See that little glint of light. Take it away, Lord Uther.
Where do I begin? I would have been perfectly fine if Jean-Luc would have died. I felt like they were really setting it up that he was going to die, and I've been trying to decide all day if that would have been a better ending, if he would have sacrificed himself, even though I just complained about it last week. So whatever. But that's how good the writing was this week. Like him saying goodbye to the bridge, and then saying goodbye to Riker, and then saying all that. I truly thought they were setting it up for his death, and because of the way they did that, I would have been fine with it. I told you guys I was cheered up a few times, and 2 of those times were him saying goodbye. It was that good. I don't think they could have ended it any better, like you said, with the next gen characters, because you can still drop them into whatever new series you come up with, as long as you don't jump ahead 150 years. And here I was, or however many years it is, 75. And here I was last week, where I posed the question, should they just move forward or should they jump ahead? And I was kind of feeling like they should jump ahead. And now I'm actually maybe jumping ahead in this episode. But with the way the episode ended, which we can talk about in a minute, I would be 100% fine if they just move forward, except for one character, one thing, which we can talk about when we get to that. I think Worf, all the characters were written perfectly. Worf finally, and this has been one of my complaints for a while, they talked about Klingons being these badass warriors. I never saw it during Next Generation. I actually saw Worf getting his ass kicked more than him kicking rear end. And like this episode, and actually the whole series, I felt like he kind of became that Klingon tough warrior that I always wanted to see. It's kind of like seeing Luke Skywalker in The Mandalorian instead of him drinking blue milk on some planet. That's a whole nother story. I was just pausing there because I'm sure you were going to endorse that horse shit writing that I had to watch for 2 movies. But anyway, we'll have that discussion at another point, Pod Racer. So, again, just it was great. I mean, now we can still drop those characters in here and there if we want. We even got a little bit of Tuvok again. I really enjoyed that. I don't want to jump ahead to the ending because there are a couple parts of not just the after credits, but just the ending itself that I feel like they kind of, I don't know. Do you want me to get into it, or you want me just to wait? What do you want to do?
Well, I was gonna take up the Worf bit because
sure.
We've kind of glossed over Worf because he's been a bit of a bit player this season. which has been fine. It's absolutely served the sort of Zen master that he was supposed to be. But how incredibly funny has Worf been? You know, because he was always kind of not a punchline in the series and on Deep Space Nine, but he had a lot of comic moments that I think were unintentional, and they leaned heavily into that with the writing here. And I have to say, when he decides to
Yep.
go on the away mission and says, "I'll make it a threesome," and Riker
Yep.
turns to him and says, "Do you even hear yourself?" It is the absolute perfect culmination of that Riker-Worf relationship that they've been fostering for so many years, and it's just I could not be happier with how they did that and how they crafted that into this badassery. And then he hands, the blade to Riker, and Riker's like, "Holy shit! Why is this so heavy?" I mean, it's just.
Well, and he gives
Again,
it, he gives it back to Riker when they beam over to the cube, and Riker says, "It's too quiet. This ship is a tomb." And Worf says dryly, like, "It sounds like you're disappointed we're not outnumbered," or there's just some like little thing like there, and it's Michael Dorn delivers it with such the right, those two, yes. You could do a little half hour with Worf and Riker just trading quips and puns and all of that. That was very good there.
Well, I love how they address them being old again with Worf sitting in the chair, and what happens? He's
Falls
so
asleep.
exhausted he
It's a cat.
falls asleep and starts snoring. How could you ask? I mean, whoever came up with that, I would love to give them a hug and just
That's
say thank you.
That's an Oscar-winning performance. Like,
It was
just-
so good.
And
Great writing.
and they had us fooled.
The acting.
They had us fooled. I not only expected Picard possibly to sacrifice himself, but I felt that Riker and Worf, like again, I mean, you know that somehow hopefully they're going to pull it all out, but you're there in the moment, tearing up because you're like, this could be it. Like this really, they've made all the emotional pushes as Data leads us into a Return of the Jedi, into the second Death Star
Yes.
trench run, which I'm sure Lord Uther will comment on, and I think that pivots to Brett Spiner. This Data post Nemesis, this version of Data that we've seen throughout this show, once he reclaimed his neural net from lore, et cetera, et cetera. This is the Data we've been waiting for, albeit in an imperfect physical form, and just imploring the crew to trust his gut, and how he says, "I hate the Borg," and he says it with the same venom like when he first samples a drink with the emotion chip in Generations. It is disgusting.
Right.
Like I say, Brett Spiner, we've sung his praises from here to the heavens, but this version of Data, and perhaps this would encourage him to do a little one episode guest spot in a future, he may not want to do 22 or 23 of these things anymore in a row, but I think his reluctance, he's always said, I didn't want to play the character because I was getting older, but I think they found a sweet spot with him. I don't think any of the cast was ill-served. The legacy cast, if you will, the next-gen cast was ill-served by this reunion. I don't think anybody came across where they didn't have moments. There's Beverly firing phasers, and everyone just kind of stops and, turns her, she's like, hey, a lot's happened in 20 years. And it's the perfect Crusher moment. I have expected Counselor Troy to volunteer to take the helm. That would have been a nice, everyone saying, no, it's okay. But,
Well, that's I was going to say, I feel like the only character that truly didn't change was probably Troy. I feel like she had the back seat the most throughout Picard, and I think what they did with Crusher, again, was brilliant writing. And just her line of, a lot has happened in the past 20 years, that's all I need to hear. You sold me, right there. That sold me that she was able to fire the torpedoes, instead of it being something that isn't explained to you and happens, because that's when I feel like that's some cheese being grated on that. But her, like, explaining it without giving like a long monologue or just glossing over it. Boom, one sentence, and you buy it. And you buy it. Like you bought a lot of this. Like this was, again, this was fan service, but like I've said before, with no cheese on it. No cheese. And when they did put cheese on it, there was that comedy piece that went with it, or the explanation that you could buy it. Again, fantastic writing.
Yeah.
Fantastic.
Well, I would submit that Troy actually has quite a bit of development here, but not in the manner that we see the other characters go through. I think you get this vibe from her appearance in season one that she sort of hung it up as a counselor. You know what I'm saying? Like,
Right.
she dials it back. They lost their son. They're just trying to be normal people, doing normal things. And Riker gets back into the Starfleet mode. He's with it. He's rolling. He's on the Jean-Luc train. Troy really isn't. She's kind of like, I'm content doing what I'm doing. And it's not until she enters the series as a captured woman under Vadic that she kind of hits this crisis point where she's like, my marriage is kind of falling apart and I'm on the brink of death. I might as well try and make it right and might as well try and get myself out of this, try and contribute. And it goes from, she's basically being saved by Riker to the complete opposite. And she does so by realizing that her strengths that she's always had, the same person she's always been, is exactly where she fits best. And she steps up and does it. And I really feel like, while it's kind of the same Deanna Troi that sat in that same chair 30 years ago, it's reinvigorated. And that's where, like, there's a part of me, and this might even be controversial because this was such a succinct and such a wonderful ending with this poker game. There's a part of me that wants to see this crew on that ship do another miniseries. Now, it doesn't have to be action-packed. It doesn't have to be anything crazy. I would love to see a sitcom version of the Enterprise where it's this old aging crew who's taking out some cadets.
That's exactly what I was going to say.
And they get into some like hijinks
Mischief.
with a trickster. Let's say,
Harry
I don't
Mudd.
know, one of our favorite tricksters from the original series. And it's pure fun. It's, maybe they solve some crises on a planet here or there that they get marooned on or whatever. But it's more in good fun. And it showcases, honestly, the range of these actors, which I think is subtly brilliant in the way that they've played out this season. I think that's one of the things about, being on Star Trek that some actors shy away from is that, unlike your Christian Slaters of the world, they feel like they're going to get pigeonholed into, oh, you were on Star Trek, you can only do, like sci-fi person type characters. Where these actors have done the full spectrum of emotion in one season of one show, and it's just how they literally are these characters. There's nobody else who could step up and play them. Like, I think they've done a nice job on Strange New Worlds, replacing Uhura, replacing Spock, replacing Pike, replacing Kirk. Those characters have been extraordinarily successful. However, I really don't think you could do the same with next generation characters. I think they are far too espoused to these actors. And I think you take the years you have left with them, they're having fun with this. Why not put them into some goofy, non-animated, just not necessarily like slapstick Three Stooges type stuff. You could have some of that, but put them in something where it's just clever dialogue. It's still Star Trek, but it's less action and more adventure and fun. And I think that would be, and I'm advocating for Paramount because I know all the executives listen to us. Terry Metalis is a big fan. I think you have this unique opportunity. You could call it like Starfleet History Museum tours, and have them do these little goofball type things. Walter Koenig could maybe like be a hologram that tours this bird of prey that they stole once upon a time. And you could talk about the nuclear vessels that they had, mine power from. Yeah. I think that would be really clever. I know you could drop them in as cameos like they did with the TOS crew in the TNG series, and I would love that. But I just think there's so much potential here. We'll hold off on the post-credit scene for a little bit, and we can talk more about why that could be impactful. But, I mean, again, we give a lot of credit to the writers, but we can't forget that the actors, I mean, absolutely knocked every single scene, every shot out of the park. And I'm gonna go ahead and say it. Season 3, episode 10, the finale, actually redeemed Rafi for me in this season. So even Rafi, the actor that portrays Rafi, even she achieved a level of greatness that I don't think you get without the supporting cast around her. So that's my bit on the acting. I just had to get that out there because I'm so blown away by it.
Well, that leads us to, without tiptoeing up to the final scene of the episode, but overall, we get the resolution and the new journey, perhaps, of one Jack Crusher. And I have to ask you as fans, so we've seen the development from cocky, arrogant space pirate to wounded Borg surrogate to now an accelerated Starfleet ensign. And then he's gifted not only with a promotion and a brand new ship, which we'll also talk about in a moment. I mean, he's got a plum future going forward, and then in a post-credits tag, he gets even more narrative story baggage laid at his feet. And I guess I want to single out for a second. We can talk about it in terms of the character as written, or we can talk about it in terms of the actor who's portraying Jack, Ed Spielers. But it seems like they've set him up to take on a lot of Star Trek story. And like he's not just going to sort of fade into the woodwork and be a guy that you see, shouting, "Shields are down 46%, Captain." Like, it feels like they're entrusting a possible future of this timeline and so not solely on his shoulders, but giving him a lot of that responsibility. And so I ask you, did he earn it as a character? Or, I mean, as an actor, do you feel like you want to follow him through some of these adventures? Let's figure out Jack Crusher here as we've reached that finish line and see, what do we think going forward, or how he got to this point to begin with. And I throw that out to whoever wants to take a crack at Jack.
I think that I saw his growth as an actor as the season progressed. Now, I'm no film guy like Ford Fairlane. I'm not exactly sure how these things work. I don't know if episodes are shot out of sequence. I know movies are shot out of sequence sometimes, right? Like,
Right.
you'll literally, your first day of shooting could be the end of the movie.
Right.
Right?
Right.
Ford? Okay. So I don't know how they do it with TV, especially this. I'm not sure how they, but I feel like he grew as an as an actor as time went on, to the point, and that's where I said I was feeling like they should jump ahead, but I would not be disappointed if this is the next step.
So
I would be
a show with
perfectly fine.
a show with the new, and let's talk about that for a second, because that's the other big Star Trek Voyage Home reference, the reveal in Space Dock of a launching point for a potential new direction that the 25th century could take us. I've seen some fan pushback already on the renaming of the Titan. I've seen people saying that was Shaw's ship, damn it, and making it the Enterprise G. I mean, a glorious reveal for us with the score, and again the callback to revealing the reconstructed Enterprise at the end of 4. But I mean, what if that's the pitch, right? What if it's Seven and Rafi and Jack and Sydney LaForge and some other crew members that we have yet to meet.
Oh,
Is that enough?
I'm sold.
Okay, that's enough to launch a new.
Yes, because
Okay.
because first of all, you got to have. I mean, here's where it goes astray. Again, the writing and the acting was so good this season. I actually liked the crew on the bridge of the Titan, and I don't even know half their names, but I still felt like I could carry on with that because that's what's going to happen, right?
He's like, I
Right, yeah, that guy, that was pretty funny.
I just took
Right, yeah.
training. Yeah.
But I'd be fine with that. The writing's got to be there. You know, how do you explain the renaming the Enterprise? Renaming the Titan. You know, you could always say, well, the year they were in space dock, they did an upgrade to Titan anyway, so now she's a tougher ship, and she, you know, now she's the, you know, Enterprise is supposed to be like the ship of the line, like it's supposed to be the representation of Starfleet. So that's how you get around that, right? Oh, they did a retrofit. As long as we're not, I don't want Jack Crusher to turn into Jack Ryan and be like, again, like we kind of alluded to before, this I can jump off the side of the wall, shoot 4 people down, and then do the ninja splits and throw a lightsaber down the hallway and take out everybody else. Like I don't want that. But I feel like Jerry Ryan has.
Is he Riker? Like, I mean, how do you see Jack? Like, is he Picard? Like, is he the lead? Is 7 of 9 the lead?
I think if they write I think if they write it well enough, as time would go on, you would see him eventually step into that role at some point. I think Jerry Ryan. I think 7 of 9 proved to me she could. I think she could be the captain and kind of run with the series.
Okay.
The only person I'm slightly concerned about is Rafi. I still have my doubts about that. That's my only tweak. But like the LaForge girls, loved them as characters. Didn't get a ton of screen time, but I love that. And I think if it was written any other way, and I'll stop talking in a second. I think if it was written any other way, the amount of cheese that would be grated on this to have a LaForge and a Picard on an Enterprise, you couldn't stand that much cheese. But it was written so well, I buy it. I can buy it 100%. I'm sold on that happening. Okay, Jack going through like this accelerator program. I mean, I feel like that was, again, that might have been a little but I'm sold enough that I would be fine with it. I'm done talking, Urza.
I as well would be very happy if they continue the series off, not quite where they left off because it's a shakedown run, and I feel like it's easy to just say something happens with the shakedown, kind of like Voyager. I think it would be more interesting if it's like, you know, maybe a little bit into the future where, you know, they've been doing routine local missions, getting their crew trained up, making substitutions where it makes sense, getting retrofits and upgrades, becoming that flagship, getting 7 a little more seasoned as a captain, as a diplomat, but still having that Kirk cowboy attitude, which I think Jerry Ryan does very well. She's very cavalier. I think Rafi is an interesting wild card because she's got a lot of like potential behind the scenes to develop some stories, like her relationship with her family, the fact that she has a granddaughter. There's a lot you could do there. Certainly there's a whole crew of the Enterprise, so you could develop new characters. And then, of course, Jack has a lot going for him, especially with Sydney LaForge. The nice thing about how they have it set up with those 3 is you really don't need one of them to take a central narrative forward. Much like you had with TNG in later seasons, any one of them can drive the story forward. The
Yeah.
core is still a Picard, and I think that you could do a lot with the crumbs that were left over. You still have some Borg around. Seven of Nine has a close connection with Borg. You've got all that Section 31 stuff. There's Rafi's plug, and then of course, I mean we're right up at it, so we might as well talk about our post-credit scene. You have, of course, Jack and Q, and I have to say I was beside myself
Yes.
when I had been hoping very much that would be paid off at some point. And I think you have an actor there who would very much like to continue to portray Q, because now he can just be himself and not be digitally de-aged, and introduce a whole new dynamic of Q in this non-linear sense. And again, dropping that non-linear catchphrase, you still have doors open with the Gamma Quadrant. You still have the Cisco, the Pa-Wraiths, the Prophets, a lot of unexplored space in the Delta Quadrant. And again, as Q mentions in the only appearance he made in DS9, there's other galaxies, you know, and the Enterprise G could be the first intergalactic traveler of Star Trek. You know, that to me, again, there's so many doors open, and they said there were doors left open, and that's with purpose, I think, and it's all going to be dependent on fan response. But just the stories one could tell, and how do you tell those stories in a compelling way in a manner where they're mini movies? You need the caliber writing we've seen this season, or you need to drop it back and build up arcs like they did in the original TNG, Voyager, DS9 series, and really TOS in a sense. And develop that weekly episodic, explore the galaxy, explore the crew, you know, set up these relationships, develop out a series rather than a mini-series or mini-movies. In my opinion, it's still the best foot forward. I still think you take the formula that works so well for so long, that we're so near and dear to, you add a little bit of the modern oomph that we've seen this season, and you have a playground, a veritable playground of plot points you could pick up and use. Not the least of which are the outstanding ones we haven't seen. The Travelers, the Neo-Borg. You know, what were the Neo-Borg's effect on the Delta Quadrant? You know, having those time-traveling Borg out there. You still have Soji around. You have, you know, you have a lot of unresolved, I think, Starfleet issues. Yes, now they can identify changelings thanks to Admiral Crusher, but there's still other changelings. There's still a lot of, you know, former enemies that hate, I mean, literally hate the Federation. And you still have all the Federation traditional enemies and the Federation traditional allies that have, at times, played devil's advocate or been that subterfuge. And with Section 31 doing nefarious things, like the Tal Shiar, there's a lot of interplay. And I think, you know, the cool thing about them doing Starfleet Academy is that's a way to build Jack up there. Have that be that year that he was in Academy before he went to Enterprise G. You could even tell that whole story in flashback, honestly. You could also work in that Section 31 movie to build out other enemies that crop back up in this new series under Captain Seven, if that's to be your Star Trek legacy, which I think makes a perfect amount of sense. And I think you can't discount the fact that you have to have Terry Matalas at the helm going forward. Kind of like we talk about on Digital Escape with put Star Wars in Jon Favreau's hands, put Star Trek in Terry Matalas' hands, at least for the future of this universe. Other shows, obviously they've had great success with other writing staff, other showrunners. I'm not taking away from that. Like, Strange New Worlds is fantastic, but I really think for these characters, there's been no more loving treatment by a showrunner than with Terry. I think he has just done an outstanding job. And, you know, while the actors helped carry a lot of what happened in this last episode, not the least of which Q, I mean, how amazing was that Q moment? But, you know, you have such high potential here. It's just, my caution would be don't fuck it up.
Well, I think the one thing that Strange New Worlds has done is proven to you that you can still have a series that is Star Trek where you're exploring things. And again, I will give in to that piece of it's not as many episodes, but with the limited time, they've done a lights out job. Now, the only caveat I will give is we know about half the crew of Strange New Worlds in terms of we know their history. So they're still bringing people on board. Here's what will crush any new series that has 7 of 9, if they move forward with this, I don't think you can let Picard become the Luke Skywalker of Star Trek. Because if that happens, then I think we're in trouble. I don't think Star Trek should turn into a series about the Picards. Again, it was so well written, I can live with it right now. But I don't want it to be all about Picard in a sense, or about, because then it turns into, is Star Wars really about this Luke's? I mean, is it really about the Skywalker family, or is Star Wars something different? And I feel like they're still trying to break away from that at times, even though they're going to make the Rey series. But
that's where I think it should be an arc. Like you have the various Q episodes in TNG, you have various Jack and Q episodes, I hope, in Legacy. But the overall driver, I think, is 7 of 9. You know, being 7 of 9 and being a captain, not being Annika Hansen. You know, being a former Borg in a post-Borg universe. I mean, you know, even in the Delta Quadrant and Voyager, you know, it was a big deal that 7 of 9 was aboard the ship. Now she's a captain of a ship. There's a lot you can unpack from that. Plus, you've got a Section 31 member as, you know, right-hand first officer.
What's the idea behind Legacy, by the way? Have they really defined what Legacy is going to be about, or are they just calling it Legacy and we're thinking it's going to be all these different stories, not really centered around one ship?
No, Metalis has, in his interviews, has said his vision for it. I mean, it's much more centered around, again, the timeline, and sort of that's why he wanted in this finale. I mean, he wanted Harry Kim, he wanted Janeway, he wanted you to be able to have these touchstones throughout the Star Trek universe that you could check in on. I mean, I don't want to put words in the writers' room's mouths, but if you wanted to do an episode that was Captain. He was going to be a captain. Captain Harry Kim and his, whatever he's, you know, doing, you could do that. If you wanted to do an episode, I mean, I feel like that it was going to be a looser, you know, it might not be focused on a single ship, a single mission, a single crew, but that you would have the space to, you know, again, address, like he said, what's going on with Kira Nerys and what's going on with, you know, I mean, so he's talked about a lot about it. Now, that could all be under the umbrella of the new Enterprise G. Hey, we're going to Terek Noir, and we're going to see what's going on. I mean, it's still possible to bring in all these story elements, but I got the impression that, you know, maybe it wouldn't be so rigid. Maybe it wouldn't just be, you know, a singularly minded ship and crew and so forth. We'll just have to wait and see. We need the boys at Paramount to jump in on the vision. 2 things about the Q scene that struck me. Number one, behind the scenes, that scene was actually filmed in episode 9 after Picard tells Jack, you're aboard, basically. They have that scene in his dimly lit quarters. What am I? What did you see? What do you know? So they wrapped Patrick Stewart for the day, and they're like with Delancey, they had like 20 minutes. So they put him in this brand new costume, and he ran out, and they did 2 takes, and that was that. And he said he's known John Delancey. Terry Matalas apparently has known him for a while. He said he was brilliant, as always, nailed it, and we moved on. But it was, again, kind of funny. It's kind of like, okay, here, hurry up, get him in here. Let's do this. So, and that speaks to, as you were asking about the process, Lord Uther, about television. Yes, in features, you can shoot wildly out of sequence depending on set availability, if you're on location, et cetera, et cetera. With television, you may still shoot out of sequence, but you're shooting the episodes pretty much, in some sort of an order. Like you're going to shoot episode 1, you're going to shoot episode 2. Now, because if we have these quote two-parter episodes where they're going to need a certain set for 2 episodes, they may shoot all that material together at once, but generally speaking, it's a little bit more linear than a feature.
Okay.
But you still might shoot like this, pulling in the post-credit scene in episode 9. But I guess what I was trying to say in my earlier question, because I didn't want to spoil Q's return until Ursa Master brought it up, I feel like we've only had 9 or 10 episodes of Jack Crusher, and his journey. And now we're placing him in this new story responsibility and so forth. And I just felt, as delightful as it was to see Q back, I felt there was a major imbalance, right? Because Patrick Stewart and his caliber, his Shakespearean caliber, he was more than a foil for Q right from Encounter at Farpoint. Like those two, every time they went head to head throughout the series and in season 2 here of Picard, like you felt that these were 2 chess pieces that were equally matched and could spar with each other with an intelligence and a wit and a cunning. You felt that the fight was fair. And I just felt that we don't know enough about Jack, either as a character or as Ed Spieler has had time to develop, because again, Patrick Stewart developed over the course of this journey. I don't feel like it's a fair fight yet to make him, quote, go through a trial. And I want to see more sides of the diamond that is Jack Crusher, so that I can feel like he, is a worthy adversary, opponent, perhaps even, frenemy of Q. And I don't think we're there right yet, but you guys
does Q mentor him? Part of my thought was I almost was viewing it like a grandfather-grandson relationship because Jack is so young. And is this going to turn into a... Now, I don't... Again, I'm not writers like you two, but the vision of it, what is the purpose of Q mentoring Jack? I could see more of a purpose of Q mentoring Wesley Crusher because of being a time traveler. That I could see. So that's why when I was asking you about how they were shooting this, I didn't know if like the popularity or the writers saw something as they were going through the series and shooting all these scenes. Is that when they decided to bring Q back and say, hey, we can make this a Picard thing now? That's why I was wondering how much that was set in stone. Was that, because I kept having the vision that this hasn't been like the past 3 Star Wars movies where they're literally writing it on the fly, that they had this, to Urza Master's point, this arc already out. They had all the scripts written and everything, though I know you do daily rewrites and all that kind of stuff. I get all that. But the main premise is still there. And I almost didn't know if they threw in the Q Jack thing at the end as like, okay, we can see this going somewhere, so let's add this in. So that's the only reason why. That's why I was bringing that up.
Well, if nothing else, I think it's a clever, fishing line to try and entice the powers that be in the fan base to say, oh yes, we want more Q, more 7, more like. I won't say that they came up with it on the spot, nor that they didn't have a pretty good sense of where they wanted to go. But I think the whole inclusion of it is really to say, hey guys, look what you'd be missing out if you didn't greenlight a few seasons of Star Trek Legacy. I mean, we're just anxious. Just get us through that door. Get us, get the race started.
Right.
So I think that factored into it as well. I just, like I say, I don't know enough about Jack Crusher to like him as much as I do this cast yet. Obviously, he's only had 10 hours to spend some time with. So, however they choose to push that forward, like I say, I want to feel, in the best possible sense, I want to be rooting for Jack Crusher to counter Q, who we know is a formidable opponent.
And here's what I will say to that, which also goes to Urza's point. The first couple seasons of Next Gen are so hit and miss. I would say up until through season 3, like 2.5, like halfway through, it's kind of hit and miss. And to your point there, Ford, the crew has had to grow on us as well. So what's the difference if we decide to do that with Jack? We're going to have to learn about Jack. We have a foundation in 7. Rafi, I feel like her story still needs to be written. You've got this whole crew that we haven't met before that's going to wind up, being their bridge crew and stuff. They don't even have a doctor on the ship as far as we know. They're
Emergency hologram.
but to Urza's point, you've gone from 20 some. I don't even know how many episodes. Was it 30 episodes during the season? But now you only have
22 and 26. Yeah.
Okay, now I got to squish that down into 12.
Right.
Which again is to Urza's point, right? Because if it's going to stream, it's not going to be 26 episodes unless they get nuts and they decide to do that. So we only have that certain amount of time to get to know that crew.
Right.
But it can happen. It happened with Next Gen. We wound up loving that crew. It took time.
And that's why I think it's the only real impactful way to do it. Producing these mini movies or these short-term movie-like series is great for what they've done so far. But, and I know I'm going to sound like a farty old man, but going back to what worked for Star Trek: The Next Generation, having a traditional television series season, 24 episodes, 26 episodes. I've always been a fan of longer seasons. 32 episodes would be perfect for me. And do a mid-season break or a mid-season cliffhanger, 2-parter episode or whatever. I think by stretching that out, and even if you did it as a weekly episodic 42-minute episodes like a TNG, I think you could just accomplish so much more storytelling, and that's always been the strength of Star Trek, dating back to the original series. I think Gene Roddenberry did it best when he took the time to really eke out every ounce of character, every ounce of nuance, and brought in, these sort of pseudo-political messaging that we saw in Season 1 and Season 2. The nice part about Season 3 is it still dealt a little bit with messaging, but it was not so over the head. It was a lot more subtle. And I feel like if they focused on doing that and crafting out just nice story arcs and setting up big bads, but not like, don't do it like Supernatural and have every season have to have a new big bad. Have a Borg-like force that kind of keeps coming back. Have Q sprinkle in a couple of times this season. Have some of the episodes just be kind of silly, like The Game, or, the Ryza episode with Vash. There's just so much, that could be done, in just such a Star Trek way that I think, not only would fans love it, but I think that would bring in a new audience and energize a whole new generation around this legacy. It's gonna bring in young and old, and I hate to borrow the metaphor from basically their plot point here, but it's gonna mesh the two together by doing it that way. And I know I'm not God's gift to television creation, but I do think I might be Q's gift. And Q is better. So, no, I really do. I feel strongly that they need to really focus on their delivery. Even if the stories are a little weak in some episodes, which I think is inevitable with any TV show, that's okay. And I think TNG and DS9 and Voyager all prove that you can have a couple episodes a season where it's like, Neelix accidentally gave everybody food poisoning. Everybody has diarrhea, and now they have to make poop jokes all show long. Hey, that was fine, by the way. Like, and now you've got this like chef come, helmsman, who's like, I don't want to drive. I want to just make sandwiches. Like they have so much. Like they have set the seeds for such a high potential show. It would be remiss to not, jump in there and jump on it and make some magic happen. But again, if you do it in a 10 or 12 episode miniseries, you're not going to get the juice you could possibly squeeze out of such talented writers and such a talented cast. It's going to turn some people off. I still think you could do it streaming. I'd like to see it on broadcast, but I think Paramount could put it on Paramount Plus, make it an exclusive, hold it back from syndication. But you could definitely sell it to syndication later, and franchise it out and be like, hey, we've done our run on streaming, but let's put it out on broadcast and bring in that, audience that doesn't pay for our service. I think they should do that with Picard, too. I know they've got physical media release, which sadly I don't own any of those yet. I'm going to wait until I can get all three at once. But,
Exactly.
Again, I get back to it's the future potential that they just can't ignore. And I really hope they don't ignore it for another 20 years and then be like, oh, we should do some Star Trek. We haven't done that in a while. So that's my plead with the powers that be at Paramount. But I think it's come time that we not only rate this episode out of 7 warp cores, but we now rate the season and the series out of 7 warp cores. So I'm asking each of you for 3 scores. I want episode 10, season 3, Star Trek Picard overall. And I'm going to have us kick it off with Ford Fairlane today.
The judges are unanimous. 7. All the way across. As a Star Trek fan who had strayed away from the series in that interim 21 years since Nemesis, who hadn't kept up with the mythology, who hadn't jumped right onto CBS All Access when Discovery launched, and Lower Decks and Prodigy and all these things, to be brought back into the fold with this much care and this much, again, I don't recognize the term fan service. I'm a fan, and that's what I want to see, whether it's, a thrilling score that calls back to Jerry Goldsmith and James Horner and classical Trek composers, to effects that are indistinguishable from a feature, to just, again, that solid character beats that can still make you tear up, 21 years after you last saw these old farts. Like I say, that's fan service, guilty, but that's exactly what the Doctor ordered. So, like the new captain of the Enterprise, I'm 7s across the board.
And you are guilty, Mr. Phantom Menace. But we'll get to that in another podcast. Let me just summarize it like this. Oh my. Because to see the USS Hikaru Sulu on that screen at different points made me happy. Again, all the callbacks that they were doing to the movies, to other characters, the Chekhov part in this episode, when you grow up loving a series, this is what you want to see happen. This is how you want to see it end. So all the times I complained to my 2 brothers here on screen that Nemesis was in and of itself a nemesis to Star Trek overall, this is why. Because this is how it should have gone down. This is how it should have played out. So with that being said, obviously the season's a 7 out of 7. This episode was 7 out of 7. if it was not for season 3 of Picard, I could not give the entire series a 7 out of 7. I will be, because I never would have had the resolution that I needed as a next gen fan that I got with this. This was needed. Anyone that loves Next Generation, this is what they expected and they needed, they wanted. It just takes care of all aspects of what you needed, the resolution that you needed with this crew and with this series. I'll leave it at that. So yes, 7s across the board again as well, which is why 7 can take over because of all these 7s.
I love it. I don't think there's any question. This is going to be a unanimous scoring, which is the first time that this has happened in the Warp Core, and it's going to be 7s across the board. This was the perfect episode of television, the perfect episode of a Star Trek series to cap off, I would say, the perfect season of a Star Trek series. Now, did each individual episode knock it out of the park 7 out of 7? No. But overall, absolutely. This was a huge win. I do see episode 9 and 10 as being a two-parter.
I agree.
And that to me put it over the top. I agree with Lord Uther. I think without season 3, the first 2 seasons would have left me feeling incomplete again. And I will go further and say that without the post-credits Q appearance, I would have felt a little less great about the denouement. It would have still been 7 out of 7, but this is like maximum warp for me, 7 out of 7. And as a series, to me, it is a 7 out of 7. But I will say that it is narrowly a 7 out of 7 because I think there was some weakness in season 1 and some weakness in season 2.
Oh, yeah.
To be honest with you, it gets back to some fundamental things about this being set in the future that I feel like, season 1 and 2 kind of made me feel like, is the Federation kind of weak? I started to question the integrity of the Federation, and I think that's a big door that's left open here at the end of the series. The other thing is there's a lot of smoking in the series, and that bothers me, like, a lot, because they did a whole bit on DS9 with Quark and Rom and Nog going back in time and being discovered as Martians at an Air Force base,
I remember the little
and
green
everybody's puffing cigarettes. They're like, why on earth would they, put poison into their bodies? And I'm like, yeah, why the fuck would they do that? And why are they doing it in season 1? Why is somebody smoking a cigar on the bridge of a fucking starship?
Oh.
Why? Now, with a villain like Vatic, I get it. They're a villain. Villains do villainy things. Lighten up, But even that doesn't quite jive with me. Like, it was a weird characterization for a changeling. Like, it just seems odd. There's some odd choices. Like, I'm fine with it. I've made peace with it. But there are a few odd choices that, like, detracted for me as somebody who's trying to suspend belief and believe that this is the future, sort of utopian Roddenberry vision. What it did do, though, is humanize it and make it a little more, I think, accessible. However, I still feel that, like, Roddenberry is probably rolling over in his grave because of not just the profanity use, but some of those choices. So, where do we boldly go from here? My fellow Starfleet folks? You think they use the term folks with the X in the future? I don't know, maybe. But my fellow Warp Core podcast hosts, we've discussed this on and off the podcast a few times, what we're going to do. But we had a major announcement very recently that this summer, returning to our streams, I was about to say airwaves. That's not the case, unless you're watching on Wi-Fi. Returning to our streams is another show we reference quite frequently, and that is Strange New Worlds. And I think, if I've read the room correctly prior to our episode tonight, I think that is our bold new direction, is we will be revisiting Season 1 and leading right into Season 2 of Strange New Worlds, where we pick things back up with probably, I think you could argue, the most attractive Starfleet crew that's ever been fielded. And I say that without singling anybody out or excluding anyone. They're all, I mean, amazing, gorgeous.
They're almost as good looking as we are.
Thank you.
Almost.
Thank you. The
Thank
Bald
you.
Boys Club.
I had to say it. Sorry, fans.
But we talk about writing a lot and acting, and I have to say that as we go through Season 1 of Strange New Worlds, that will be another recurring theme that we tap into a lot. Because, again, this is a series that does a lot, sometimes with very little, and sometimes they do way more than you thought they could do with a very established story. And I won't tease it anymore, because I think it's going to be really great. So join us next time
Really good.
on the 20th episode. This is a big milestone. The 20th episode of the Warp Core podcast. As you know, we have gone through each and every original series film, each and every Next Generation film, and all of Star Trek Picard. Now we boldly go to the strange new beyond. And with that, I'll sign us off with the live long and prosper.